welcome everybody. We have a very special session today. It's a CHERA seminar with Dr. Peidong, which is going to bring us a very interesting topic, but it's also the first time that these seminars are done in partnership with the Consortium of Higher Education Researchers. I hope all of you that are in the audience, either from Asia, Europe, or from North America, or any other part of the world, will enjoy and appreciate this topic that brings us here, which is towards a framework for rethinking the ethics and politics of international student mobility. And let me just tell you a little bit about the speaker. Dr. Peidong is an assistant professor at the National Institute of Education at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His main research interests are located at the intersections of education and migration mobility. And he has conducted research projects in Singapore state-sponsored scholarship schemes for Chinese students, Indian students pursuing English medium medical degrees in China, and more recently, immigrant teachers and immigrant parenting in Singapore. His research interests also extend more broadly to immigration-related issues in the context of Singapore and social studies education topics such as diversity, identity, and globalization. He is the author of International Mobility and Educational Desire, Chinese Foreign Talent Students in Singapore. So we are extremely lucky to have an expert in the field of higher education, but also migration, mobility. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have a very stimulating talk. So having said this and making the presentations, I'll pass on the floor to the speaker. So Peidong, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hugo, for that kind introduction. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me speaking now. Is it all right?
Yes, perfectly
okay,
fine.
Great. Okay, great. It's a great pleasure to be here online this afternoon with Hong Kong U. It's my first time interacting with CHERA and Hong Kong U, so it's really a privilege. So today I want to offer some of my thinking about the ethics and politics in international student mobility, which is my primary area of research. Now, by looking at the names of people on this forum, I would imagine many of you are actually international students. Perhaps many of you are studying in Hong Kong, but I see based on the names, I think quite a number of you may be from mainland China. So international student mobility is an experience that many of us can relate to. And I think what I want to offer in this talk is some thoughts about the ethical and political dimension of it. Now, let me move on with my slide. Let me begin by first offering a definition of student mobility, because I don't assume everybody here works on student mobility, right? Maybe you're interested broadly in higher education. So international student mobility is generally defined as, or mobile students are defined as individuals who physically cross an international border between two countries with the objective of seeking participate in educational activities. This is the definition that provided by UNESCO, and is the definition that most scholars use. Something that's worth mentioning is that forms of transnational educational collaboration, such as distance learning programs and the TNE, for example, universities offering a branch campus or programs on another country, these programs are not considered student mobility. So mobility has to be physical mobility. Now, one thing you might want to note in this definition of student mobility is that it does not specifically refer to higher education. But the interesting thing is, if you look at UNESCO's statistics for international student mobility, they in fact only collect data for tertiary level students. So when scholars, and most scholars, when they talk about international student mobility, or ISM for short, they draw on this set of data, the UNESCO data, and that implicitly refers to ISM in higher education. So when I talk about ISM, I'm really referring to ISM in tertiary / higher education sector. And I hope that makes this relevant to the context of the hosting institution, right? Because I understand your main area is higher education. Okay, So that's quickly the definition. Now, a broad picture about international student mobility in the last decades. International student mobility in the 1990s remained about 1 million plus, but in the last 2 decades or so, it had seen a quite steady increase from 1.9 million in 1993 to up to most recent data available, 2020, 6.3 million. So over this something like slightly more than 2 decades, we've seen student mobility increase by threefold, and that's quite significant. And of course, it's worth pointing out that these numbers are the number of international students at any point in time. It's not a cumulative number. So students who have had international mobility experience but who have returned in the country are not counted in this, right? So that would be a much larger pool. So international educational mobility experience has become a much more sort of common these days compared to before, and that makes the topic, I guess, relevant for us. The next slide on the left-hand side shows the global geographical distribution of international students. So in 2020, we have about 6.3 million of international students, and these figures show how they are distributed across major continents. What you will notice is that Europe as a continent hosts the largest number of students, but followed by Asia and North America, right? So those are the 3 major destinations. But what's also interesting is that we understand that global student mobility generally has a directionality towards the developed countries. But what has emerged in the more recent years is the diversification of destination countries. So Asia, even countries such as China have become a significant player. And this is shown on the evidenced on the right-hand panel. What you see is the major destination countries in 2020 versus 2000 and the year 2020. What you see is, of course, the major suspects, right? The major Western English-speaking countries as host countries. But if you compare the two lists, in 2020, you do see countries such as China and even Russia, appearing on the list. And in fact, just before COVID struck, China was the ranked number 3 in terms of the total number of students hosted, of foreign students hosted. And but I won't be going into detail about China's role in this paper, but what we actually know is that China's hosting of international students is quite interesting, in that a larger number of them are not degree-seeking students. So there will be a larger number of credit mobility students, and the majority of students hosted in China come from developing countries. So that's an interesting thing. But what the general message I guess I want to share here is that in the recent decade, we've seen a diversification of hosting countries in favor of non-traditional countries, non-traditional destinations, as in English speaking or European Western countries. Okay, so that's a general picture of student mobility as the background to my talk. Now the themes of my today's presentation is really about the ethics and politics. So let me quickly define these terms. So ethics in my paper is defined as I draw on Sharon Stein's work, and it is defined as a relational domain where ethical commitments are informed by particular conceptualizations of relationality. So ethics is about how we relate to each other, how groups and individuals relate to each other. To further draw on philosopher John Dewey's conception, ethics is essentially the science that deals with conduct, right? The goodness or badness, or whether conduct is right or wrong, right? That's the essential, that's what ethics is about. On the other hand, politics refers broadly to issues involving relations of power and domination. So when I talk about ethics and politics, I'm referring to these sort of issues. Now, it's important to note that in this paper, I talk about ethics and politics as deeply intertwined matters because, again, let me cite Sharon Stein, who says that ethical frameworks are not articulated or enacted in political vacuums. Rather, ethics are formulated, situated, and negotiated within and between particular social historical contexts, collectivities, subjectivities, and power relations. Right? Thus, the politics are not supplemental to ethics, but instead centrally inform the context, content, and framing of any particular ethical approach to engagement. Now, to put it simply, really, when we think about issues of ethics, namely how individuals and groups relate to each other, we must not lose sight of the political context in which these relations are encompassed. Okay. So before I move towards delineating a framework for thinking about ethics and politics, it is important for me to sort of highlight some of the how these issues, ethical and political issues, have been discussed in existing literature, right? So this is a little bit of a quick literature review on how ethical and political issues feature either implicitly or explicitly in literature on international students. The first thing is what I call intercultural interaction. So the early educational scholarship on international students, apart from those that focus on pedagogy or teaching learning related issues, have given a great deal of attention to this issue called, intercultural adaptation, right? Similar terms used are, acculturation, adaptation, and adjustment. I'm quite sure some of you actually research on these kind of topics. I've recently reviewed a paper for higher education on something along these lines, and a lot of these papers have emerged from contexts such as Australia and UK because they were the forerunners in receiving a lot of Asian Asian origin international students. But this literature was soon critiqued for displaying or having a kind of a deficit view of international students, as if international students are the ones who need to adapt, are the ones who having some kind of a intercultural deficiency, therefore they need to make an effort to adapt. So scholars were quite sensitive to the implied asymmetrical power relations in this kind of research about adaptation and acculturation. So more recently, I think scholars have moved away from words such as adaptation to things like adjustment or even transition, right? So as to downplay the kind of sort of implying that international students are the ones who need to adapt. Rather, I think scholars are now making the argument that the host country, the host community, have to equally make a effort to adapt, to adjust to international students. So that's the implicit sort of way in which ethics and politics are implicitly mentioned in early scholarship. The second strand of literature that I want to quickly mention is by authors such as Simon Marginson and his colleagues, who have written about international student security and well-being. And what's unique about their approach to this issue was that they actually invoke the prism of human rights. So treating international students' rights and experience as a matter of security. They really use the kind of language of security related to human rights that we often hear about in the kind of United Nations kind of debate about human rights and human security. They've applied that lens to understanding international students by highlighting the kind of vulnerabilities that students undergo when they study abroad, right? In a context where they feel depowered and feel very much lacking in agency, right? So this was the second way in which ethics and politics feature in previous scholarship. I think also what has happened in the last 2 decades is this emergence of a very multidisciplinary scholarship on student mobility, with participation, from various disciplines, right? Scholars such as human geographers, sociologists, anthropologists. So people beyond education as a field have also taken an interest in the rise of student mobility. And within this broad sort of multidisciplinary field, student mobility is sometimes seen as a type of skilled migration or precursor to skilled migration, because there is always the transition from studying abroad to working abroad, right? This study to work transition. And so a lot of the lenses in migration studies have been applied to looking at student experiences. Another very major theme in this multidisciplinary scholarship on ISM in the last 2 decades is this Bourdieusian lens, emphasizing education, especially international education, as a mechanism for relatively privileged social groups and individuals to reproduce their privilege, right? Studying abroad is usually expensive and costly, right? Although we are seeing more diversification in terms of the socioeconomic class from which students are coming from, but generally, right, student mobility is not within the reach of the least privileged in society, right? Generally, you have to have some kind of resources before you can attain student mobility, right? So that has implication for social justice and the inequality, right? Because we're talking about social reproduction. Okay, so these are some of the ways in which ethics and politics have featured in previous research. Now, the next step in my presentation is I want to sort of go a little bit deeper to highlight two broad critical perspectives or conceptual lenses from which a lot of these critical discussions about ethics and politics are anchored in. According to my reading, the two perspectives are primarily a neoliberal perspective and a post-colonial perspective, right? Under the neoliberal perspective, or the neoliberal perspective has highlighted the commodification of higher education and the marketization of international student mobility. So for many countries that receive international students, this is treated as a massive and very profitable sort of export industry. And scholars have critiqued that international students are being treated as cash cow, and I think we are all very cognizant of that reality, right? But the consequence for that is that when study abroad is commercialized and the students are treated, as a cash cow, there's the risk of this student-teacher or student-educator relationship being turned into or being looked at from a sort of a customer or a service provider kind of perspective, which becomes very transactional. And that has implications for, how we think of, because education is of course, it is a service, it is a commodity, but it also has certain qualities that go beyond that, right? The nurturing aspect, the intellectual aspect. But when a neoliberal logic becomes very explicit, that has implication for how students are being treated and how the entire sort of experience features for students, right? And there are and people who take a neoliberal perspective have even made more serious allegations or challenges about whether this commodification of higher education goes against some of the fundamental principles that many Western liberal democracy hold dear, namely ideals such as that education should be a human right, that everybody should be allowed access to as equitably as possible. But what we are seeing in international higher education is that it's very much depend on how much resources you have. So that have implication for equitable access and social justice more broadly. The other perspective that a lot of scholars have sort of critically looked at ethical and political issues in student mobility is post-colonialism. So very simply put, post-colonial perspectives draws attention to the enduring legacies of centuries of Western political economic dominance of the world, right, as a result of colonialism, and how these continue to structure economic, cultural, political realities today, right? So scholars who have used the post-colonial lens draw our attention to issues of this presumption that of the superiority and the universality of Western knowledge, right? Most internationally mobile students still have a hierarchy of destination where the Western, the English-speaking countries remain on the top, and that's based on this assumption of the superiority and the universality of Western knowledge and of Western education. So that reflects in the asymmetrical ISM flow that we observe, right? Until today, one major direction is still from the global south to the global north, or from the developing to the developed countries in terms of flow of students. Other than this more macro perspective, the post-colonial perspective has also been used to make us sensitive about what goes on in the micro settings of teaching, right? So a lot of scholars such as Sophie Lohmer and so on have looked at how curriculum and the teaching within higher education classrooms are still predicated on this superiority of Western knowledge, Western paradigms of knowing, and English language mediated content knowledge, and all this has an effect of making rendering non-English speaking global South students feel more disempowered and marginalized, right? And then a lot of questions have been asked whether there is this need for decolonizing the curriculum, making curriculum and learning content more more sort of friendly or sort of more inclusive towards the needs of students coming from diverse backgrounds, right? So there's a lot of discussion about that. We must see the neoliberal and the post-colonial perspective as deeply imbricated, because as Bozeman and Miller pointed out, Western higher education institutions' current dominance of educational internationalization and ISM is to be seen as a continuation of former imperial and political connections that have evolved into financially beneficial markets and source of income for Western universities. And I think this reality is quite explicit to us, right? For those of us who know a little bit about what's going on in terms of for example, Chinese students' desire for studying abroad, we are very much aware of this. Okay, so now having laid the ground of examined existing literature of how some of the ethical and political issues have featured, I want to offer a framework for thinking about ethics and politics in ISM. Now, I want to first say that what I'm offering will not be substantive or normative injunctions or precepts about ethics and politics. What I'm offering here is a bare elements of how to think about the possibilities of relationships between different actors and between different types of relationships that emerge from the field of student mobility. So I'm offering sort of a skeletal sort of framework, but not passing necessarily any normative judgments or making any claims about how or what should be ethical or what is not ethical, right? So that's not my aim, at least not in this paper. Okay. So in my effort to come up with a framework for thinking about the ethics and the politics of ISM, I thought it would be first incumbent upon us to sort of just look at what are the key actors in in international student mobility, right? Because if ethics is about relationality, then we need to think about what are the participants, what are the actors. And in my paper, I've enumerated a list of 8 actors. Now, this paper was written a couple of years ago. So, as I continue to think about it, I also sometimes wonder whether I've left out any, particular actors and so on. And so here I do, as I go through this paper, I do want to hear from the participants as well. If you think I've missed out any or you have any suggestion as I continue to update my thinking on this. Okay, so to very quickly go through the list, right? Obviously, the key actors include number one, first, mobile students themselves. Secondly, the educational intermediaries, right? These are the study abroad agencies and the brokers, which I think, they play a very important role. And if time permits, later I do have some insights about, the recent insights about their way of operating, which raise many ethical issues. Thirdly, education providers. So either in the private or public sector. So these could be the universities or the private colleges that provide education to international students. Number 4, the sending country communities, right? So by communities, I mean not only the family members, but also the neighborhood, the cities, and the broad, in a more abstract sense, the national community behind the students who go abroad to study. Then we have the sending country policymakers and the regulators. They do play a role in shaping and directing student mobility, right? Again, here I may use the example of China. So in the last few years, when China's diplomatic relationship deteriorated with Australia, the Chinese government did want students not to go to study there. And the same thing has happened with respect to USA as a destination, right? So sending country policymakers, the governments, regulators have a way or have power to shape perceptions and directions of student flow. Number 6, we have the receiving country communities. So this could be the faculty and students in the university where international students study. This could be the cities in which these universities are located. This could be the larger, broader, societal sort of, national society of the receiving country, which all have perceptions about, the benefits and drawbacks of having, large number of international students, and they do shape discourse and, and the policy as well, right? In many countries, we've seen, locals, protesting against, the influx of international students, and sometimes policymakers have actually reacted to that by restricting flows and so on. I think that's actually going on right now in the UK. So that leads to the receiving country policymakers and regulators who, they obviously shape the visa policies and so on and so forth, right? And the last but not least, international global governance bodies or mechanisms. When I first wrote this paper, what I had in mind was, supranational bodies such as EU, which has the for example, the Erasmus program, of which student mobility is a huge component, right, in forging a European identity. But I think more lately, I've come to realize another type of transnational actor, which is private sector actor, has a huge role to play, and this is the ranking tables agencies, right? Think about how much we pay, students, particularly would-be international students, pay attention to ranking tables such as QS, and how strongly these shape students' perceptions and the direction of study abroad. They actually are a sort of a player that has and what they do has a lot of implication in terms of ethics and politics as well. Okay, so those are the key actors. And on the right hand side of this slide, I list 4 sets of concepts that I've identified from literature that could be useful for thinking about ethics and politics. So if you put everything together, what I have here is, if you draw any possible connections between all these 8 actors, then you see a multitude of possible relationships. So here I'm not offering any detailed, normative claims as to what these relationships should be. I'm just giving you the sort of framework for thinking what are the possible relationships that occur between these different actors, right? Just by drawing out these lines. But I think one analytical distinction we could possibly make, and it's between the difference between social relationships and the institutional relationships, right? By social relationships, I mean those relationships that occur primarily between individuals, groups, and communities. And I think when it comes to social relationships, perhaps the primary concern, or the term that's most relevant, is ethics. Just as when it comes to institutional relationships, it is politics that comes to the fore. By institutional relationships, I refer to those relationships that obtain between sovereign or sub-sovereign institutional actors and official sort of organizations, such as governments and universities, right? That forge between these type of bodies, right? There is a certain official or institutional character to the kind of relationships that arise here. So, and when it comes to this type of relationships, because power, it's much more explicitly implicated, right? We may think that maybe so there's a correspondence between power and the institutional relationships on the one hand, and ethics and the social relationships on the other. But then I have to say also that the social relation, this demarcation between the social and institutional, it's in a sense artificial. These relationships, they really are sort of on the spectrum, and it may not be useful to separate them in a very sort of clean-cut kind of way, but I'm drawing out the sort of nature, the slightly different nature between the possible relationships that emerge from these among these 8 actors. Okay, so so let me now talk a little bit about 4 sets of key concepts that I think scholars have used to think about ethics and politics to date, and these form the sort of basic sort of thinking tools that we can begin to develop more further exploration about these issues. So the first sets are the rights and responsibility, right? And we've mentioned about this in terms of this commodification of higher education. So in the literature to date, there is this tendency to associate rights as a student right and the student right as consumer right. And but what I think we've seen from the work of Simon Marginson is that the perspective of human rights also comes to the fore. So we need to move beyond just thinking a sort of neoliberal reading of rights and of rights when it comes to students. Another feature, I think, or another sort of a characteristic of existing literature is that when it comes to the discourse of responsibility, it tends to be responsibility of the institutions. In a sense, it's natural because the institutions and the more organizational actors in ISM tend to be more powerful. So they are the ones that we primarily look at when we think about responsibilities, right? So this is how the existing literature looks like. But what I think we need to look at also is, can we think in terms of the reverse? So for example, what are the responsibilities for international students themselves, right? To think of them not only as bearers of rights, but also bearers of responsibility. And here I can give you some examples of in terms of, for example, academic integrity, right? International students study in a different language and in institutions or study subjects that they are very unfamiliar with, and then the issue of academic integrity often emerges, right? And so how should we look about that, right? Is this also an area of thinking about international student responsibility, and also international students' own responsibility towards the communities that they impact, right? The host country community and so forth, right? So that's another area that I think deserves more attention. The second set of concepts involve hospitality and reciprocity, right? So here my discussion is really very sketchy, and later I will refer you to my paper, but I would just have to quickly mention this. So scholars such as Joseph Ploner talked about academic hospitality, right? What it means to be hospitable in the context of international education. I think the trend in more recent times is that scholars are starting to think of hospitality as a mutual sort of a matter, rather a mutual relation, rather than just host being hospitable to the guest. Because even as international students primarily are in the position of the guest, when they study in a foreign country, they also form their small communities into which they can be hospitable towards members of the host country. So here I can again give an example, which is kind of a recent observation. In many Western universities, including those in UK, and I don't know what the situation in Hong Kong, there are certain programs where there's a huge concentration of foreign students, right? You could have a class of a certain in certain subjects where maybe 80%, 70% of students are from mainland China, and now they suddenly become the majority in that class. And then we can raise the question, if they become the dominant in that micro environment, isn't there also some agency for them to be hospitable to the minority who are the other international students and local students who happen to be in that class, right? So that I think there's an interesting reversal as we see international student mobility pattern evolve. Okay, so C, justice and equality. These concepts are, I think, have been more long-running in the literature. All right, so earlier on, as I mentioned, a lot of scholars have worried about the social reproductive kind of consequences of international student mobility as the more privileged class or members of the more privileged social groups, enjoy the best opportunity to study abroad and convert that into different forms of capital, right? The Bourdieusian lens is being used very pervasively here. So justice equality has been another concept, significant concept. And the last set of concepts are desire and the recognition. And here I have written some work myself that use these concepts. The concepts of desire and the recognition here sort of draws eclectically from a philosophical and the psychoanalytic perspectives, scholars who have written using these concepts have looked at desire both negatively and positively. Now, in negative terms, a strong desire for education makes students, international students, vulnerable to exploitation and the manipulation. So just think about how, in today's context, how much, let's say mainland Chinese students desire to study abroad and study in prestigious university abroad, and desire the ability to be cosmopolitan and speak English, right? This makes them, potentially quite vulnerable to, unscrupulous recruitment agents and, even host institutions who may want to take advantage of their strong desire for this kind of educational service, right? So that's the negative reading or negative interpretation of desire. There is also a more positive understanding of desire, which my own work has sort of contributed towards a little bit. I see desire as something that's more generative and transformative. And here I've been informed by a philosophical perspective that is sort of Hegelian, right? So I recall one of the key ideas in Hegel was this idea of a self-consciousness is desire in general. That as you develop a self-consciousness as you go through this experience of encountering otherness, what you want to do is you want to overcome that otherness and achieve a more expansive self-consciousness. So I see this desire as a process of self-transformation, of self-making, so some of my work, previous work, including my work on Chinese students in Singapore, has used this kind of lens to look at desire. Okay, so and then of course all these are have implications for thinking about ethics and politics in the broader terms. Okay, so those are some of the terms I've used so far. so to put everything together, that we have this kind of very busy diagram, which encapsulates what I've said to date. Now, everything I've said here up to this point, it's essentially from this paper published in 2020 in Journal of Studies in International Education. So I had to omit a lot of details, which so if you are interested, do check this out. If I could have another just 5 minutes or so, is that all right? I want to, yeah.
Of course, yes, of course.
Okay. So if I can take a little bit more time, I want to now delve into a little bit more recent thinking about these issues. And here, what I want to do really is to highlight these two terms of power and the transactionality. So this is my more recent thinking as I continue to observe the field of international student mobility. Now, okay, again, this is a very busy slide, but I hope I will make sense by elaborating. By thinking of power, of course, power has already been discussed, right? In my discussion of, politics, right? Politics is about power and dominance. But if we think about specifically some of the power relations within, international student mobility, I start to see some very problematic or, really issues that we need to pay attention. So first of all, the first item on the right, host institutions, host education providers power mobile students, right? Of course, we are, so the neoliberal perspective instructs us to see students as consumers, as customers. But, in Chinese context, you've heard of this term that, customers is like the god. You demand whatever, the people have to cater to you because you are the one who is paying. So so the service provider has to cater to you. But it strikes me that in education, the nature of this relationship is actually quite the reverse. Because in this context, because the commodity is knowledge and the service provider is the authority in knowledge, right? Like professors, universities, highly ranked universities. So when the consumers come to you to learn knowledge, they are actually in a very powerless position. Right. Now, what are the implications? Again, I will give you a very blatant example. So for example, let's say students whose English language ability is not very strong, when they want to get admitted to, highly ranked university, it is within the discretion of the host institution to sell them not just the degree itself, but also foundational language programs, right? So a lot of students, in order to get into a university of their desire, they would be willing to do all this. So what we see is really very powerless consumers, right? And not to mention then again, you think about, students whose, let's say students whose English language is not very strong. When they study in a class context, they may not even be able to judge whether the content of learning being presented to them is of good quality or not. So this is another case where I think you might have really, the asymmetry in terms of power is just very drastic. Okay, so I guess I'm being a little bit provocative in using these examples because that's what I kind of observe as China's outbound student mobility is really accelerated in the last few years. Okay, the second item I want to mention is receiving country policymakers' power over mobile students. Here, of course, we can talk about the visa rules, migration pathways. So think about when UK used to use post-study work visa to incentivize students to study there, and then they scrapped it because they are afraid of too much migration, and then they reinstituted it in order to again revitalize the industry. So students are subject to the mercy of all these policy shifts and turns. But another sort of example here I can think of, it's Ben Melvi's work on African students in China. So to a country like China, which it's not primarily on the sort of export industry model of student mobility or international education, they want international students primarily as a sort of a sign of cosmopolitanism and soft power. So international students can become pawns in this soft power gambit or the diplomatic gambit, and that really reduces them from complex subjects having their own desires to really objects to of utility to the host country, right? So that's another ethical implication and political implication I can think of. Yes, so we are looking at number 3, education agencies' power over mobile students, right? And here we, as I continue to observe how the field of student mobility, I realize the for students who do not have a lot of information about studying abroad, the sway that study abroad agencies have over these students is tremendous, right? So which school to go for, and how students are really at the mercy of the information sort of because of the information gap, they are at the mercy of these education agents. Okay, finally, I want to talk about international mechanisms. So here is the ranking table example, right? So in my recent conversations with some Chinese international students, you know, when they decide or think about which destinations to go for for their study abroad, right? It is not primarily the reputation or the sort of educational quality, because in many ranking tables we have student satisfaction tables and versus the more sort of conventional tables. To a lot of students, whether you get a a satisfactory or good experience in in studying abroad, it's secondary to how official institutions regard the reputation or the ranking of your institution. So the most blatant example here is when foreign degrees are being converted to, are recognized in China, for example. There are Chinese cities which have, designated list of universities or, QS ranking numbers that you have to meet in order to enjoy certain perks. So to just give a random example, for example, right, in order to settle back in Shanghai with certain privileges or, with ability to move your household registration to Shanghai, you must graduate from QS top 50 or 30 kind of university. And this kind of policies have been rolled out by certain, municipalities and, the government in general in China. And that really has implications for how students, mobility, the flow and, its structure. So I do think that and we know that these ranking agencies, they themselves operate primarily as a business, right? So they know their power in influencing people's perceptions and students' perceptions. So that also makes them having a tremendous amount of leverage over universities who want to be ranked higher, right? So we see a very sort of a complex ecosystem where many ethical and political questions really emerge. Okay, I think I've taken quite a bit of time. So I think in order to leave some time for discussion, I will stop here. Although I had the aspect on transactionality, but I think it's better not to go into that right now because that might take too much time. We can maybe, yeah. So I will leave it here, and thank you very much for listening.